This is the Werewolf episode on WZLD Radio with special guest Lord Greggor of Vale Keep. Welcome to WZLD Radio. Tonight we have a special guest. Lord Greggor of Vale Keep will be here talking everything about werewolves. Help me welcome Lord Greggor by subscribing and clicking the like button. Thank you for being here in the studio, Lord Greggor. We are all excited for you to be here and share your knowledge of werewolves.
I'm always happy to be here with you, Lady Zelda. It is my pleasure to share with you and to all that are listening. I know werewolves are a topic that intrigues you. Let us get started. There is an old entrance on the northern side of Vale Keep that has not been used for centuries. We called it Black Pine Gate. Although today there is very little left to suggest that a gate ever stood there at all. A portion of the stone wall remains, along with one iron hinge that has nearly disappeared beneath the earth. And unless someone knew precisely where to look, I doubt they would notice it. In the winter of 1594, however, Black Pine Gate was still one of the entrances into the keep. And what happened there one night was enough that I eventually ordered it closed for good. That winter was particularly severe, even for the Shumava. Snow had begun before sunset, and continued until the forest surrounding Vale Keep was little more than a wall of black trees beyond an endless stretch of white. The men stationed at the northern gate were accustomed to such weather, and they were certainly accustomed to wolves. Wolves were plentiful in those days, particularly during the winter months, when hunger brought them closer to the settlements, so hearing one howl somewhere beyond the wall would normally have caused very little concern. What disturbed the guards that night was the way the wolves called to one another. One howl came from deep in the forest, another answered from somewhere toward the east, and a third sounded from the west. Then a fourth answered from directly beyond the gate. The men could not see anything at first, but they had the distinct impression that the animals were not wandering through the forest at all. They seemed to be positioning themselves around the clearing. A man named Stefan was in command of the watch that night. He had been raised in those mountains and had hunted those forests since he was a boy. So there were few men at Vale Keep who understood wolves better than he did. When the younger guards began joking about being surrounded by a hungry pack, Stefan told them to be quiet and listen. Years later, when he described the incident to me, he said there was something about those calls that troubled him because the wolves did not sound as though they were hunting or communicating with one another. In his words, they sounded as though they were announcing that they had arrived. Eventually, the first animal appeared at the edge of the trees. The men could see only its eyes at first, and then the shape of an unusually large wolf became visible against the snow. Before long, another appeared, followed by a third and then a fourth. The strange thing was that none of them approached the gate. They simply remained at the edge of the clearing, each standing apart from the others and watching the men upon the wall. Stefan ordered the gate checked and the iron brace secured, although everything had already been locked for the night. The younger men apparently thought he was being overly cautious until they heard something scratching against the other side of the wooden doors. It was not a violent sound. Whatever was outside seemed almost patient, drawing its claws slowly across the wood and then stopping long enough for the guards to wonder if they had imagined it. That was when someone outside spoke. The voice simply said, "Open." Stefan called through the gate and demanded that whoever was there identify himself. But the only answer was the same word spoken again. One of the younger guards started toward the entrance, believing perhaps that a traveler had become stranded in the storm. Stefan stopped him before he reached it, reminding him that 4 wolves were still standing at the edge of the forest and that none of them had moved. Then the voice outside called the young guard by name. That ended any thought of opening the gate. No stranger traveling through the mountains should have known the names of the men assigned to the Northern Watch, particularly because those assignments had been made inside Vale Keep only hours earlier. Yet the voice continued. It called another man by name and then another, until it had spoken the name of every guard standing behind Black Pine Gate. Every guard except Stefan. He later told me that he would almost have preferred hearing his own name, because the fact that the voice ignored him made him feel as though whatever stood outside already knew something about him that the others did not. The scratching began again, only now it came from much higher on the gate. Stefan realized that whatever had been near the ground moments earlier seemed to have risen onto 2 feet. He ordered the men to move away from the entrance, and shortly afterwards something struck the doors hard enough to shake the entire frame. A second blow bent part of the iron brace, and several of the younger guards wanted to abandon their position altogether. Stefan refused to allow it. He told them that if something outside was powerful enough to break through Black Pine Gate, running deeper into Vale Keep would accomplish very little. Their best chance was to remain together and hold the entrance. They waited for another blow, but none came. The scratching stopped as well, and after several minutes the entire clearing became quiet. Even the wolves disappeared without another howl. The guards remained there until sunrise, expecting at any moment to hear the creature return, but nothing else happened. When daylight finally came, Stefan opened Black Pine Gate and stepped outside. The 4 wolves had left no obvious tracks where the men had seen them standing, but there was one set of prints crossing the clearing from the forest toward the gate. They belonged to a very large wolf and were easy to follow in the fresh snow. Halfway across the clearing, however, something changed. The impressions of the front paws disappeared. From that point forward, the creature had walked upright. 2 tracks continued toward the gate exactly as the footprints of a man might have done, except that they retained the shape of the animal's hind feet. Those prints continued all the way to the entrance and stopped directly before it. There were no tracks leading back into the forest, none traveling alongside the wall, and none indicating that the creature had gone anywhere at all. It was simply gone. Stefan sent for me, and I remember standing in that clearing, while the men waited for me to explain what they had witnessed. I studied the tracks myself and could offer them no explanation that would have made them feel any better. I told them only that whatever had approached Vale Keep during the night was no ordinary wolf, and that no one was to follow the tracks into the forest. By that time, I had already heard many of the old stories told throughout the villages surrounding Vale Keep. Most concerned men who became wolves through curses, sorcery, or some other misfortune, and I had learned long before not to dismiss every such story simply because it sounded impossible. There was another belief, however, that was spoken of much less often. Some of the oldest people in those mountains believed there were creatures that began as wolves and somehow
Become a
learned to imitate men.
WZLD supporter today. Subscribe and like so you don't miss any future episodes. I am Lady
I have always
Zelda,
thought
bringing
there
you
is
the
something
best in
considerably more
stories and
disturbing
music.
about that possibility. A man who becomes a wolf may still remember that he was once human. A wolf that learns how to become a man has no humanity to remember. Black Pine Gate was used only rarely after that winter, and eventually I ordered another entrance constructed farther along the wall. In time, the old gate fell into ruin, and nearly everyone at Vale Keep forgot why we had stopped using it in the first place. I did not forget. There was one part of the story that troubled me more than the tracks, the voice, or even the creature standing upright outside the gate. Stefan had been the only man whose name it did not call, and several days afterward I finally asked him why he thought that was. He was reluctant to answer me, but eventually he told me something that none of the other guards knew. When Stefan was a boy, his father had taken him hunting in those same woods. They wounded an unusually large wolf and followed its blood trail until late in the day. His father eventually ordered Stefan to remain where he was while he followed the animal deeper into the forest alone. Stefan waited for hours. His father never returned. For most of his life, Stefan assumed that the wolf had killed him, or that his father had become lost in the mountains and died from exposure. He had accepted that explanation because there was no reason to believe anything else. But on the night something stood outside Black Pine Gate calling the guards by name, Stefan heard a voice he had not heard since he was a child. It was his father's voice, and that, I believe, was why the creature never needed to call Stefan by name. It already knew that he was listening. You are listening to WZLD Radio. I am Lord Greggor of Vale Keep, here with Lady Zelda. Since we are speaking of werewolves tonight, I know the question many of you have been waiting to ask. Have I ever seen one? The answer is yes, although I will tell you exactly what I saw and allow you to decide what it was. I was traveling alone through the Carpathian Arc late at night. This was long before proper roads crossed much of that region, and traveling through those mountains after dark was never something one did casually. The forest was dense, the terrain difficult, and once the light disappeared, distance became almost impossible to judge. At first, I noticed nothing unusual. Then I became aware of movement somewhere behind me. It was subtle at first, little more than the sense that something was traveling in the same direction I was. I increased my pace, and the movement increased with me. I moved faster again, and whatever followed did not fall behind. That was the moment I understood that I was not being followed by something struggling to keep pace. Whatever it was choosing to remain at a distance. I decided that confronting it would be unwise. There are times when courage is useful, and there are times when courage is merely vanity wearing armor. That night, I had no intention of confusing the two. I left the trail and climbed into the trees, moving high enough that I could observe the forest floor while remaining difficult to see. For several minutes, there was nothing. Then the creature stepped into a small clearing beneath me. It was enormous. Even allowing for darkness and distance, I would estimate its height at somewhere near 7.5 feet. The shoulders were extraordinarily broad, and the arms seemed longer than human proportion would suggest. It did not stand quite like a man, yet neither did it move like any wolf I had ever seen. The posture was somewhere between the two. The head was what I remember most clearly. The muzzle was long, the teeth easily visible even before it opened its mouth, and when it finally stopped beneath the trees, it lifted its head and began drawing in the air. It knew I was there, I am certain of that. Then it growled. I have heard wolves at close range. I have heard bears. I have heard wounded horses and dying men on battlefields. I had never heard anything quite like that sound. It was deep enough that I felt the vibration through the tree before I fully registered it with my ears. I remained perfectly still. The creature moved slowly around the clearing, searching the darkness above it. At one point it stopped almost directly beneath me, and for several moments I believed it might climb. Had it done so, I suspect the encounter would have ended very differently. Instead, it simply watched. There was no dramatic charge, no howl, no sudden attack. After several long moments, it turned and moved back into the forest, disappearing so completely that I could no longer hear it. I remained in that tree for a very long time afterward, and before anyone asks, no, I did not follow it. Immortality and stupidity are not the same thing. I never again traveled that part of the Carpathian Arc at night. If I must cross the region after dark now, I use the vale rather than the mountain roads. You may call what I saw a wolf, a bear, an unknown animal that distorted by darkness, or anything else that allows you to sleep comfortably. I can only tell you what happened. Something followed me through those mountains. It was large enough that confrontation would have been foolish, intelligent enough to understand that I had hidden from it, and aware enough to know almost exactly where I was. But there is one detail I have never forgotten. When it stood beneath the trees and looked upward, I had the distinct impression that it was not merely trying to find me. It was deciding what to do about me. That is the reason I leave the Carpathians to the werewolves after sunset.
Become a WZLD supporter today. Subscribe and like so you don't miss any future episodes. I am Lady Zelda, bringing you the best in stories and music.
Long before I was born, Vale Keep already carried stories that no one spoke of after sunset. One of the oldest concerns a winter in the late 14th century, when the snows came early and sealed the roads through the Shumava. For nearly 3 weeks, no traveler reached the keep, and no one inside could leave. The forest became walls of white, the night seemed unnaturally long, and every sound beyond the gates carried farther than it should. It began with livestock. A goat disappeared from a lower pen, though the gate remained barred from the inside. 2 nights later, a sheep was found standing perfectly still in the courtyard, trembling so badly that one of the stablemen thought it ill. When he approached, the animal broke free and ran itself against the stone wall until its legs gave out. No one understood why. Then the dog stopped barking. That frightened the guards more than anything else. The keep maintained several large hounds near the outer yard, animals trained to warn of wolves, strangers, or anything moving near the walls. They barked at wind, deer, drunk servants, and shadows. But for 3 nights they made no sound at all. They hid beneath the steps. Men began to whisper that something was moving beyond the tree line. The captain of the guard dismissed it as wolves driven closer by hunger. He ordered additional torches along the wall and doubled the night watch. On the 4th night, one of the sentries disappeared. His lantern was found burning beside the western parapet. His sword was still sheathed. There were no tracks in the snow leading away from his post, only a long impression beside the wall, as though something heavy had crouched there for some time. By morning, fear had spread through the keep. That evening, just before midnight, the bell above the west tower rang once, only once. The guards rushed to the wall and found no one near the rope. Then the bell rang again, this time from below them. Not above, below. Several men later swore they heard the sound coming from somewhere outside the wall, deep within the trees. That should have been impossible. The bell was iron and fixed to the tower. Yet the same low note sounded again from the forest. One of the older servants crossed himself and said something had learned the sound of the keep. No one left. The captain ordered the gates sealed, and no one was permitted outside after dark. For 2 nights nothing happened. Then a scratching began at the eastern door. Not pounding, not claws tearing at wood, just a slow, patient scraping. 3 strokes, a pause, 3 strokes again. The men guarding the door stood with spears ready but did not open it. The scratching continued for nearly an hour. Then came a voice, a human voice. It called the name of one of the guards. The man nearly dropped his weapon. The voice belonged to the sentry who had vanished from the western wall. It asked to be let inside. It said it was cold. It said it had been lost in the snow. And then it began to cry. Several men moved toward the door, but the captain stopped them. He asked the voice a question only the missing sentry should have known. There was silence. Then something on the other side of the door left. Not like a man. Not entirely. The sound began low and almost human, then lengthened into something that made the torches along the corridor tremble in their brackets. The scratching stopped. No one slept that night. At dawn, they opened the door. There were tracks in the snow. They began as bare human footprints directly outside the gate. After several yards, the shape changed. The heel lifted, the toes lengthened, the impressions deepened, and by the time the trail reached the forest, they resembled the tracks of an enormous wolf, but larger, far larger. The men followed them only as far as the first trees. There they found the missing sentry, alive. He was sitting against a trunk staring toward the keep. He could not remember leaving his post. He could not remember the previous 4 days. And when they brought him inside, something remarkable happened. Every dog in the courtyard began screaming, not barking, screaming. They tore at their chains trying to get away from him. The sentry remained at Vale Keep until nightfall. Then he disappeared again, this time from a locked room. The window was too narrow for a grown man to pass through, yet the iron bars had been bent outward. They never found him. But for many years afterward, guards stationed on the eastern wall claimed that during the deepest winter nights, something enormous could occasionally be seen standing at the edge of the forest. It never approached the keep. It simply watched. And sometimes, when the moon was very thin and the snow carried sound across the valley, the old west bell would ring once. Then, from somewhere among the trees, another bell would answer. Many years later, I asked Beryl whether the story had any truth to it. He became unusually quiet. Then he told me there had once been an eastern door at Vale Keep. I had never seen it. He explained that it had been sealed with stone before I was born. I asked him why. Beryl looked toward the forest and answered only this: because some doors should never be opened twice.
This is the Werewolf episode on WZLD Radio with special guest Lord Greggor of Vale Keep.
There was a time in my life when I believed that nearly anything could be understood if one watched it long enough. I thought that fear usually came from not knowing what stood in front of you, and that once a man understood the habits of a creature, the way it hunted, the things it feared, and the things it wanted, then whatever power that creature held over him would lessen. I was much younger then, and I had not yet learned that there are some things in this world that become more frightening the more you understand them. This happened in 1571, when a farmer from a village south of Vale Keep came to see me shortly before sunset. He was a practical man, and not someone given to superstition, which was one of the reasons I listened carefully when he told me that livestock had been disappearing from the village for several weeks. Sheep had gone first, followed by cattle, and eventually several dogs. Wolves were common throughout that part of the Shumava, particularly in hard seasons, and the villagers had assumed that a pack had moved closer in search of food. The problem was that the animals were not being eaten. They were sometimes found outside their enclosures, dead but otherwise largely untouched, as though whatever had killed them had done so for no other reason than the ability to do it. By the time the farmer came to Vale Keep, several families were keeping fires burning all night, and sleeping together beneath the same roofs, because they had begun to fear that whatever was killing their animals might eventually become interested in something else. A few nights before his arrival, one of the villagers had seen what he believed was responsible. He could not describe it particularly well because the sighting had lasted only a few seconds, but he was certain it was much larger than any wolf he had ever encountered. What troubled him most was not the size of the creature, but the way it reacted when it realized it had been seen. He said it had turned toward him and remained perfectly still, and he had the distinct impression that he was not looking at an animal startled by a human being. He felt instead that the creature was considering him. I agreed to go to the village the following evening and took 4 men from Vale Keep with me. We chose the barn where the most recent animal had disappeared and settled there before darkness fell. I expected a long and uneventful night, and for several hours that was precisely what we had. It was some time after midnight when every dog in the village began barking at once. There was no gradual spreading of sound from one house to another. It seemed that every animal had sensed the same thing at nearly the same instant, and just as suddenly as the barking began, it stopped. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had heard before. I have always believed there are 2 kinds of silence in the forest. One tells you that nothing is nearby. The other tells you that everything nearby is trying very hard not to be noticed. That night, standing inside that barn, I knew immediately which kind of silence surrounded us. One of the men with me whispered that something was outside, and after a moment I heard it as well. There was slow, heavy breathing very near the door, but whatever stood there made no effort to enter. It remained outside for several minutes, and then began moving around the barn. At first, the footsteps sounded like those of a large animal walking naturally on 4 legs. But somewhere along the side of the building the rhythm changed, and there were only 2. A short distance later, 4 feet touched the ground again. No one inside the barn spoke because there was nothing any of us could have said that would have made what we were hearing more reasonable. Whatever was moving around that building seemed perfectly capable of deciding how it wished to walk. When it finally completed its circuit of the barn, it stopped outside the door once more. I was prepared for it to try to force its way inside. But instead, a voice came from the darkness and asked for me. It did not call me Lord Greggor, nor did it use my full name. It simply said Greggor, with the familiarity of someone who knew me. I opened the door expecting to find a man standing there, but the yard was empty. There were no human footprints anywhere near the entrance. There was only a single set of wolf tracks crossing the snow and continuing through the village toward the forest. We followed them, although I will admit now that doing so was perhaps more pride than wisdom. The tracks were easy to see beneath the moonlight and continued for several miles through the trees, before I noticed the direction in which we were traveling. They were leading north, toward Vale Keep. That changed the entire matter for me. Until then, I had assumed that we were pursuing whatever had been killing the animals. Standing there in the forest, however, I began to wonder whether the livestock had ever been the purpose at all. It occurred to me that perhaps the attacks had been nothing more than a way of attracting attention, and perhaps the farmer had done exactly whatever was out there expected him to do when he came asking for my help. We returned to Vale Keep before dawn. I ordered the gates secured and the number of guards doubled, although nothing appeared to follow us home. By the time I reached my chamber, I had nearly convinced myself that we had left the creature somewhere in the forest. I slept for some time before waking with the unmistakable feeling that I was no longer alone. At first, I could not determine what had awakened me, and then I heard the same slow breathing outside my chamber door that we had heard outside the barn. I reached for my sword and listened, while something dragged itself slowly down the wood. The sound was not violent. Whoever stood outside was in no hurry. After a moment, the scratching stopped and a voice told me to open the door. It was my voice. I do not mean that it sounded somewhat like me, nor that it was an imitation a clever man might have attempted after hearing me speak. It was my voice. Exactly. The tone was correct, the cadence was correct, and even the slight impatience in the words sounded like something I might have said myself. I remained silent, and after a time, the voice called again. Then it laughed, and that was somehow worse because I recognized my own laugh coming from the other side of the door. I have faced many things in my life that other men would have considered terrifying, but I will admit that sitting there in darkness listening to something I could not see speak with my voice frightened me in a way that very little ever has. I remained inside the chamber until morning. When the guards arrived, I opened the door and found human footprints beginning directly outside it. They continued down the corridor toward the staircase, and we followed them together. Halfway down the stairs, the footprints changed. What had been the impression of human feet became the tracks of a wolf, and those tracks continued through the great hall toward the main entrance. They ended there. The doors had not been opened, and every guard on duty swore that nothing had entered or left during the night. I believed them because there were too many men stationed there for something large enough to leave those tracks to pass unnoticed.
Become a WZLD supporter today. Subscribe and like so you don't miss any future episodes. I am Lady Zelda, bringing you the best in stories and music.
For several weeks afterward, nothing more happened. The animals in the village stopped disappearing, the strange tracks vanished, and no one at Vale Keep heard anything unusual. I began to think that whatever had followed me home had lost interest. Then a woodcutter arrived, came on carrying one of my coats. I recognized it immediately because it had disappeared from my chamber several months earlier. I had assumed one of the servants had misplaced it, but the woodcutter told me he had found it hanging high in a tree deep within the forest. It was far beyond the reach of any man standing on the ground, and beneath the tree was a single set of wolf tracks circling the trunk again and again. That coat troubled me more than anything else because it meant the creature had known something about me long before I ever went to the village. It had possessed something carrying my scent. It knew my name, and at some point it had learned my voice well enough to reproduce it perfectly. I could no longer believe that our encounter had been accidental. Whatever this thing was, it had been watching me, perhaps for weeks or even months, and I began to wonder whether the livestock, the farmer, and even the journey to the village had merely been part of some longer curiosity it had about me. I never discovered precisely what it wanted. Perhaps it meant to kill me, although if that had been its only purpose, there were easier ways to attempt it. Perhaps it wished merely to frighten me, but I have never believed that explanation either. I have wondered instead whether it was studying me, learning my scent, my clothing, my habits, and the sound of my voice. There were old stories in those mountains about men who became wolves, but there were darker stories as well about wolves that learned to imitate men. After what happened outside my chamber, I could no longer dismiss those stories so easily. For many years afterward, I occasionally found myself imagining what might have happened had the creature continued learning. If it could reproduce my voice so perfectly, perhaps given enough time it might have learned my appearance as well. I wondered what would happen if one night something walked through the gates of Vale Keep looking like me. speaking like me and behaving closely enough like me that no one questioned its arrival. Most people who knew me only casually might never have noticed anything at all. The question that has stayed with me for centuries is not whether such a creature could have fooled the guards at the gate. The question is how long it might have lived among the people of Vale Keep before the person who knew me best finally looked into its eyes and realized that Lord Greggor was no longer Lord Greggor.
Thank you for listening to WZLD Radio. Tonight we thank our special guest, Lord Greggor of Vale Keep. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in. See you next time. Good night, everyone.
Thank you for having me tonight as your special guest, Veliana. I enjoyed telling my stories. Thank you all for listening to WZLD Radio with Lady Zelda. I will be back again to share more. Good night.